Before we get started, I wanted to say two different things. One of them is um, I'm on Tumblr and Instagram. I am avoiding Facebook. Oh my God. I went on last night. That was a mistake. But somebody on Tumblr was a student and, is forwarded to somebody I am following. And he said, I'm unable to function as a college student. Trapped in our homes, we're worried about money, worried about getting sick, we're lonely, we're unable to concentrate, and professors are like, well, here's the material. I mean, that's, come on, get a grip, professor. And another person added to that, and then a third person added to that saying, I'm a professor, and yes, believe me, we fully understand. This is weird and surreal and depressing, and it's hard to concentrate, hard to get anything done, and why are we going to college in this nightmare apocalypse? And um, we have to do our jobs. That's how we get paid. If we don't teach you, we don't get paid. So there was this attempt to say, look, we understand, but we have our own reasons. And I want to say that I see it somewhat differently. I don't disagree. This is surreal, depressing, lonely, scary. Um, the economic situation for you, your age, is much scarier than the health situation. And very few of you are going to die from this. Very, very few. There will be some. They have, but it's rare. You're worried about your relatives. That's less rare, yes. But I'm teaching Social 300, and they're already worried about graduating into an induced depression, not just economic recession, depression. And you'll probably think about the same thing next December. But I wanted to say I study world history. Three of you know that. And throughout world history, there have been pandemics. The Black Death, uh, Native Americans when the Europeans showed up. There was cholera and typhus in the 19th century, the 1800s. There was this global pandemic in 1918. You may have heard reference to it. Something like 50 to 100 million people died around the world 102 years ago. And what I want to focus on is we'll get through this. We will recover. Almost everybody will be with us when we get over this. And the economy will recover. Governments are far more on this than they were in previous pandemics. You will have lives beyond this, and it's worth thinking about those lives. It's worth hanging on to the future. It's hard, it's difficult. Some of you are like, it's fine. But for many of you, I get the sense it's not fine. And I want to give you some hope. People have faced these things much worse. The Black Death was called that because portions of the body would turn purple and then black, and then they die. And the mortality rate was astronomical. There's estimates of 1/3 to 60%, so 30% to 60% dead. It's like half society. 1/3 of society, half of society gone. We're facing 2-3%, and it's mostly old people. Um, so look to the future. Keep that in mind. And everything that you're hearing about this pandemic is based on research. It's again the I'm going to say it again. The report that Maria Schmeckley and her students wrote said a lot of students think, research, who cares? I don't need it. Again, you need to be a good consumer of research and understand how evidence works and how your thoughts shape evidence and what your question is and how do you go about answering it. The overall question for the class. How do you know what you know? That's worth putting in your face and making you think about it in college for when you get out into being employed. How do you know what you know? So This is far more relevant than it seems as you're studying it, and you will be using it next fall in either qualitative research with Maria or quantitative and maybe some qualitative research with Frank. So um, I'm trying to be encouraging. I don't know if it's working, but I think that's really important to keep in mind. We will get through this. The other issue is I'm normally behind at this point in the semester, so I plan for something short. I hope this is short, mercifully short. Um, we're not getting behind now because I'm not taking your questions and going off on tangents. And so let's hope this is short. The examples I will use are from my dissertation and from COVID-19, but there's a couple others I'm going to use. So the argument today is that case study research design is very common and very useful. I have never taught case studies in this class before. Every semester I add a reading, take away a reading, I don't know, change 3 or 4 readings a semester. I don't change a lot, but over 3 or 4 times teaching it, it suddenly looks somewhat like a different course. This is completely new. This is how I did my research. My dissertation, the bicycle stuff. That'll be some of the examples. And it's worth knowing that it's very common. Lots and lots and lots of research is done as a case study. And it can be very useful if you know what to do with it. So, who uses case studies? Let's start with why it's so common. It's a seemingly weird place to start, but I'm making the argument that they're common. So the social sciences, comparative historical sociology most of all, that's almost always case studies. Political science, a lot of case studies in political science. History, anthropology, almost all field work could be called case study in anthropology. Psychology, you'll have a case of something. Economics, pretty rare, but it does happen. It's worth noting that those are basic research, and there are practical disciplines: public policy, public administration, medicine. There's doctors are supposed to, doctors at teaching hospitals to who are professors to get tenure. They have to publish. A lot of their publications are case studies. Public health, law. I mean, think about law and how it works. If you go to court, you are now a case number, blah, blah, blah. And the court clerk reads that, and then the judge says, okay, let's start. Business, Harvard Law School, no, I'm sorry, Harvard Business School has a relatively well-known set of publications of business cases. And here are case studies of businesses. People go to that to study case studies in business. People around the country in MBA programs teach out of the Harvard case studies. Social workers, they take on a case. Again, my wife's a social worker. She has what she calls a caseload. This is why the reading, naturalism, positivism, and constructionism. I haven't taught naturalism. That's probably why that seemed weird, if it did seem weird. The social sciences, back at A, are basic research. The underlying principles of humans and human groups, like physics, the underlying principles of how the physical world works, chemistry, the underlying principles of how matter works, atoms and molecules and electrons, and it's not applied. It's not very useful. You can turn it into something useful, but it isn't useful. It's just background knowledge, and people tend to sneer at it. And you go to college and like, okay, I learned a bunch of stuff in books and I can't use it. Practical disciplines are very concerned with how to, let's put this to work. Let's apply it to the real world to get stuff done. That's a naturalistic approach. And then positivism and constructionism are pretty much in the social sciences. And um, so public policy administration, medicine, public health, law, business, social work, those are all naturalistic approaches, and they can be also positivist and also constructionist. But economics and political science are not going to be very naturalistic. You can get a PhD in economics and go to work for the government, go to work for a bank, go to work for a corporation. Um, Sociology and anthropology are split between positivism and constructionism. Historians are mostly constructionists. So I can almost guarantee that at some point, someone in public health will write a PhD dissertation on COVID-19 as a case study. If there's going to be research after this is over on why it happened, how to prevent it, etc. Very naturalistic, very practical. And they will use case study methods. I can almost guarantee at least one person will. So now that I've tried to establish it's very common, what is it? Okay. First of all, what is a case? And the definition is an instance or example of something. So doctors will talk about a case of cancer, a case of breast cancer, testicular cancer, pancreatic cancer, a case of COVID-19, a case of herpes, a case of whatever. Courts, as I said, talk about the case number. Detectives say they're working on a case. Social workers work on a case. I did a case study. Usually a case is pretty concrete. So, like I mentioned Anna Morocco's book, Odd Couples. You wouldn't say gay, straight friendships are a case of friendships. You'd say it's a type of friendships. Whereas you encounter a lesbian and a straight guy who are best friends. That you would say they are a case of gay, straight friendship. So cases tend to be very concrete. Examples in the real world that you are then going to study. So you could say that Anna's book, it has, I think she goes over like 6 or 7, 5 to 7 different friend couples. So that would be a case study of 5 to 7 cases. And the reading said, and this is really useful, it's a bounded system. A case is a bounded system. You set boundaries around it. What is part of the case and what is not. So let's look at a literal physical case. It's from the Latin capsa, C-A-P-S-A, to hold. So a case is a container. It holds something. A briefcase, a suitcase. Those objects very obviously have boundaries. You've put something in the suitcase. You're in the suitcase. Don't get in the suitcase. You've put something in the suitcase, or it's not in the suitcase. This is also true when you're doing research. The boundaries of my cases were the national borders of France and of the United States. And the time boundaries were, well, 1875 to 1910, and now in 1865 to 1914, when I get back to it. So the boundaries of COVID-19 would be geographically global, and it would start in December 2019, and we don't know when it will end. But thinking about literal cases, containers, helps think about when you do research, you define a case, you have to define the boundaries. And that's the third thing I'm saying here. You decide what a case is based on your research question. The question decides the case. In part, it is always a case of something. In my research, it's a case of a national market. Marie Schmeckley's research will be a case of a department's sociology majors. So when we say study, case and study, this quote is really useful. It gets seen differently. A research design, an approach, a method, an outcome. I would say a design or an approach. A design, or she's right, a design or a strategy, but I would say that rather than a method, because you can use lots of different methods in case study research. but it's an overall way to approach a research question, to answer a research question. And certainly within sociology, and definitely within comparative historical sociology, it's a type of overall research design. So, for example, I wanted to understand markets better. What's a market? I wanted to understand what capitalism is. What is capitalism? How does it work? And I was encouraged to get a little more concrete. Capitalism works on markets. What's a market? Well, there's sellers and there's buyers. How do they deal with each other? How do they interact? I was told by my dissertation chair, who I'm going to talk about later, Jack Goldstone, that I should pick a case. He encouraged a case study. And I picked bicycles because I have that in my personal history, and I was in Davis, California. I was at the University of California, Davis, getting a PhD. One of the best bicycle cities in the country. And I thought, hey, bicycles. It just occurred to me one night. And then I had to narrow the boundaries of the case down by time and by place. I wanted to do the global bicycle market, and that there was not nearly enough to do that. So I did these two case studies, a comparative case study, and I would say I definitely understand markets better having done this study. If I moved into lipstick or perfume or movies or illegal drugs and studied those markets for consumer products, clothing, furniture, I'd be able to go in way faster and analyze them way more easily because I did this about bicycles. Because my focus was markets, and I did a case study about markets. Another issue and another way to define a case study is to look at N. And this is a capital N, and I put it in quotes to emphasize that when you talk about N, you're talking about the number of, yes, cases. Statistical, quantitative social scientists will say these are cases. How many cases do you have? Well, I have 400. So, I mentioned I talked about sampling. I mentioned if you had 100 Americans as a sample and they stood for 325 million, it's not very representative. And I went through all the intersections of identities and experiences that really would make you want to have many more in your sample. So I often stuck on 400. That's 400 cases. So we would say N equals 400. And 1,000 is very typical in political polling in the United States. Political polling, you call 1,000 people and you try to make sure that you get them to be very representative of the American population so you can predict the outcome. Or use a few hundred if it's like a state race or a county race or a city race or something. So that now is confusing, right? Well, if those are case studies too, right? I mean, an N of 400 means 400 cases means those are case studies. Well, usually the language we use when we say, I'm doing a case study, implies one case or maybe two cases, and at the most 3. I mean, as I said, Anna went up to 5 to 7 cases of gay-straight friendships. That's possible. People do that. The most common case studies are 1 or 2. Certainly in comparative historical sociology, it's almost always 1 or 2. You will get larger cases. And the reason you limit it that much, we will get to in a minute. As soon as you get to like 30, 50 cases, you're not doing what people think of as a case study. So technically, all studies are case studies, but when you say case study, you mean a small N study. 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 or 5. And that leads to the next issue, which is what are the characteristics of a case study? What are case studies like when you do them? So, first, you have your question and what sort of data are going to answer the question. Almost always qualitative. I have the word qualitative here. It's actually, in a case study, it's whatever you can find. Qualitative documents, qualitative interviews, qualitative participant observation, but it's also quantitative. It is quantitative sometimes, not as much, but I used numbers. I had numbers. You're going to see that later. Whatever you can get, but I'll get to this in a minute, but I'll give away a little bit. You're trying to get as much depth into the case. You're going deep rather than broad. 400 cases, 1,000 cases, that's broad, shallow. This is deep. So you'll use whatever you can, and the majority of it will be qualitative. Also, and this is more interesting, often researchers, especially qualitative researchers, will not say, I'm doing a case study. It's almost understood or assumed or unconscious. I would say that, in effect, is what they're doing. I don't know that Maria Schmeckley would call her study last semester or next semester a case study, but it passes the duck test. Have you heard of the duck test? If it flies like a duck, and it waddles like a duck, and it swims like a duck, and it quacks like a duck, most importantly, quacks like a duck, you know what? It's probably a duck. And what she's doing operates like a case study, so I'd say it's a case study. And if you don't believe that there's such a thing as a duck test, look it up. It's on Wikipedia. Just type in duck test. It's a very useful article, actually. It's about reasoning. You know, if it has these features, then it must be, well, so much qualitative research has these features, it must be a case study. So lots of qualitative research is done as a case study. So once you collect your data, your qualitative and maybe your quantitative data, then you look for patterns. And there are at least two ways to look for patterns. One would be narrative. You know, you're not doing chi-square, you're not doing regression or any statistical techniques from 275 or a graduate stat class, and you're not coding the way someone would in grounded theory or the way someone would with max QDA. You're coding very differently if you're even coding. I kind of sort of coded in order to write my outline and then write my narrative. And it was a narrative. It was a story. I narrated. This happened in bicycles. Then this happened in bicycles. Then this happened. That's one way to analyze and use the data that you have collected. Historical case studies or case studies that tell a story are very, very common. And in fact, a lot of case studies are two parts. They'll tell the story and then they'll break it down into aspects. And that's the other way you can organize and look for patterns. Anna's book was organized that way. She used each couple to illustrate different aspects of gay-straight friendships. How do you advise your friend on romantic relationships? How do you navigate romantic relationships? Like if you're male, you're a straight male, and you have a lesbian friend, and you have a girlfriend. The girlfriend, is she suspicious? Is she friendly? Are they great friends? Do you use your lesbian friend to advise on how your girlfriend, you know, that was one of the issues. Another issue would be, what does the public think of your friendship? So, you know, the very offensive term fag hag is a good indicator of what a lot of people think of such friendships. That's one reason Anna didn't use it. It's such a disgusting term. Even though it was funny the way she proposed to do that title. But how do people navigate, you know, not just romantic relationships, but family and friends? You've got this gay-straight friendship. That's a different aspect. Misunderstandings you have with your friend. That was another aspect. So you can tell a story, or you can break it down into different aspects, or you can do both in your data analysis. why a case study? Why do you do them? And here's where I get to depth versus breadth. So breadth is broad, wide, big, geographically, that's the metaphor. So it's shallow. If you have 1,000 cases, you're not going to go deeply into 1,000 cases. You're going to go very shallow. You ask them 2 or 3 questions, 5 questions, and you're done. That's it. If you go deep, then you get to know a lot about 1 or 2 things. And I got to know a lot about 5 or 7 things. If somebody does COVID-19 2, 3, 4 years from now, they're going to get to know a lot about, first of all, the disease itself, the virus itself, the symptoms, how the symptoms progress. And if they're doing public health, then not only that, then they're going to talk about how it originated, how it mutated in animals and spread to humans, how humans spread it throughout China, how almost immediately it spread. They would tell a narrative, as I'm telling you, but they would go deep into this one pandemic. They would not talk about lots and lots and lots of pandemics throughout world history. They would just go deep into one. I dug deeply. I know a lot about bicycles in France and the United States, but I know a lot about the industries. I know a lot about the shops. I know a lot about the riders. I mean, they're all dead now because it was over 100 years ago. But I know a lot about that, and it's helped me understand markets in general, the depth that I achieved in learning about these very particular markets. And my goal was theoretical innovation. So the book says, one book, there are 2 readings. One reading says mostly descriptive, maybe a little exploratory. The other says, no, description, exploration, and explanation. And I'm with her. I'm with that one. That was the second reading. Yes, if something's really new. So going back to online interaction in the late 90s. I think I mentioned this earlier in the semester when we were still face-to-face. Yeah, I did. The Lori Kendall, who's now at University of Illinois, and I was a teaching assistant for her one quarter. We were on the quarter system at Davis. She did a lot of research on online interaction, chat rooms and email and other stuff. And those all tended to be case studies. You'd go to one chat room and study how things worked in that chat room. That was pretty much descriptive, maybe a little exploratory. But it was really descriptive because it was so very new. And that's when something's new, that's where you begin. Just what do you see? But I disagree that that is the only function of case studies. Exploration, get to know the phenomenon really well. So my own research was more exploratory, explanatory. I mean, I wanted to find out, I purposely chose France and the United States because their outcomes were so different. In the 1890s, there was this bicycle popularity, and after 1900, bicycles just continued to get more and more and more popular in Europe, and totally collapsed in the United States, just gone. And it could not possibly have been automobiles. That's what everybody always says. And the numbers of automobiles that were sold simply cannot replace bicycles. That's not what happened. I tried to explain this difference between these 2 countries, and that helps us understand markets more generally. Explain generally. That's what theory does. Theory explains across a lot of cases. So a good example of this was, my approach was exploratory and I moved toward explanation, and I'm trying to maybe not generate a theory of markets, but help us understand markets better so that at some point we could generate a better theory of markets. A good example of how this works is my dissertation chair, Jack Goldstone, who was at Davis, and he's moved to George Mason near Washington, D.C. His dissertation at Harvard was on the English Civil War. Now, probably you guys don't know that England had a civil war in the 1640s. Yes, they were a republic for 11 years. The Republicans won. Republicans meaning republic, not monarchy. And I know, stay with me. This sounds incredibly obscure, and they're all dead now, and who the hell cares? And it was England anyway. No, stay with me. So Jack's this grad student at Harvard, and his PhD committee shoots him down because he proposes something about population, and they say, oh, that's already been done. He develops a new way to think about the effect of population on revolutions, civil wars. He does his dissertation on the English Civil War, and then he applies over the next few years his thinking on the English Civil War to the French Revolution, to rebellions in the Ottoman Empire, which is now Turkey, um, changes of dynasty in China, the Meiji Restoration in Japan in the 1860s. He took his ideas from this one case study and applied it to other cases. And he came up with a general understanding of revolution. I mean, the book is called Revolution and Rebellion in the Early Modern World, and he published it in 1991, and it was prize winning. And he's gone on to do research in revolutions and government failure and government collapse, and he's a political sociologist. And he's branched out beyond just a population explanation. But it started his whole career, and he's contributed a lot to our understanding of revolutions. Just because he studied this obscure civil war in England in the 1640s, now we have a much better understanding of revolutions in general because he innovated theoretically. He came up with an explanation that worked one place, worked another place in time, worked another place in time. I said this would be mercifully short, and here is the last issue, sampling. So in the last two lectures I talked about getting as many um, cases, getting n as high as possible to have a more representative sample, if you can do it in a random way, and so on. So then an n of 1, that goes against everything I was saying. What the hell? One case? It's not going to tell us anything. No, that's not true. It's not terrible sampling. You're going to go into depth. Remember, you're going to get to know the 1, or in my case 2, or in Anna's case 5 to 7, or Jack's case, I don't know, 6 or 7 or 8 revolutions. You're going to get to know that one case really, really, really deeply. And so your first cut, and really and nobody talks about this enough, what you're really doing when you're doing a case study is it's multi-level. You start with an N of 1 or 2, and then you sample within each case. That's what's really done without people really knowing it. So I will use examples you've seen before. I'm going to use them again. And no, I wasn't able to copy it over from my dissertation to make it bigger, and I don't have the time. I got to get this to you. The number of registered bicycles in France. See, so look at the bicycle boom starts in the early 1890s, 1892, 1893, 1894, 95, and it really just keeps going all the way to 1914, when the First World War starts and the French have better things to do than ride bikes, like keep the Germans from killing them all. So you can see it goes up, and you can see that I am using quantitative data. And you can also see that this is an attempt at a census. You can see the source at the bottom, Annuaire Statistique de la France, 1914, 1915. The government registered bicycles, just like you have to register your car. It started with bicycles. And so they're trying to get a census of all bicycle riders, not all French people, all bicycle riders. And they mostly did it. You can see I adjusted for noncompliance. Um, but this is trying to be a census. And so I'm not even sampling. I'm trying to get a sense of overall ridership in France. It's different in the United States. To understand the uh, rise and fall of bicycling in the United States, I had to get creative. And as I said, I ran across the microfilm room in the Library of Congress one day in the year 2000 and spent the most boring time of my dissertation research copying pages from city directories, which were the ancestors of phone books, listing bike shops. And then I had to process this and I came up with these numbers. Incredibly useful. These are samples. This is Denver, Providence, Rhode Island, Baltimore, Maryland, and St. Louis, Missouri. This is what number of bike shops per so many population in each city. You can see very clearly they peak in 1897 or mostly in 1898. And then bicycle shops go down. And they're a proxy for actual use. You know, people are buying bicycles, but their tires go flat, their chains need grease, they want to buy accessories. The more people use bicycles, the more shops there are going to be. And when people stop using bicycles, there aren't going to be many shops. So this is very much not a census. This is a sample, but I'm sampling within my case study, within one of my cases. And, you know, when I go back to this project, I'm going to sample quite a few other cities, but I'm betting they'll all tell the same story. This rising to a peak in 1898 or so, and then trailing off. But this is a good example of sampling within the case. And it's also a good example of something that historians especially, but also historical sociologists, people who study society over time, that's what historical sociology is. You know, we exist in time. Societies change. The problem is in history, stuff doesn't survive. I was in Connecticut and a guy at an archive was talking to me about how businesses just throw out their records. They go out of business, they just throw them out. Factory gets torn down, they just throw out the files. And he heard about something, and there was this big pile of archives in the middle of the floor. And he pulled his pickup truck and he just dumped stuff. Oh, we're going to organize these files later. Let's just get them. Because the Connecticut Historical Society had so few business records. Most stuff from history doesn't survive. How do you know what happened in the past? How do you follow trends? That's the real reason to study history. Trends from the past, in the present, into the future. You live inside trends. You may not even realize it, but you do. We all do. That's what a lot of historical social scientists study. And if stuff doesn't survive, we can't find out about it. So it's just a little note. It's definitely a non-probability sample. Don't know if it's biased. You don't know if it's representative. You have to do a lot of what's called triangulation. Different kinds of data on the same sub-question in your research. But stuff doesn't survive, so you can't even sample all that well. Your data, your base of data, the amount of data you get is really, really frustrating for anybody who does any kind of historical research. And so you have to get very creative because historical sociologists so often do case studies. Okay, I hope I've made a case. See, a case. I've made an argument that case study research is very common. And I also hope to have shown you at least a few aspects. I don't think I was complete. But I hope I've shown you aspects of case study research that make it very useful.